Hello, students of world history. Welcome to Unit 6. This is Part 1. We're talking about post-classical China and also Japan. We haven't talked about Japan yet. We have talked quite a bit about China. You might remember that we just a couple of units ago completed studying about the Qin dynasty with Qin Shi Huangdi, who was an emperor who was known for his very strong control and cruelty. And then we had the Han Dynasty, which lasted about 300 years or so, really around the same time that the Roman Empire was going on. And then things, as always, fell apart in China, and then a new dynasty or dynasties will take over. I think you'll see a lot of the same stories that we've talked about before, reoccurring time and time again. Just some new inventions, perhaps, but a lot of things that just kind of repeat from things that we saw before. And then I'm kind of excited to talk about Japan because we haven't yet, and the relationship between China and Japan going through history is really a fascinating one, especially as we get more towards nowadays or the last 150 years or so. Well, I want to talk about three new dynasties. The first one is called the Sui Dynasty, and you can see there's a couple of hundred years from the time that the Han Dynasty collapsed to the Sui Dynasty. Um, it's really a dynasty that we won't do too much with, other than just to let you know that they created a connection between the two main rivers of China, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, and they connected them with a canal. It's a man-made river essentially, and this was really quite important because it was enabling the southern part of China, which was really quite rich in rice in particular. It allowed the people of southern China to bring their rice up to feed the northerners. However, this is also something that destroys the Sui dynasty because peasants were forced to work on the canal. Peasants were also forced to work on a continuation of the wall that we saw from earlier times. And um, because they were forced to work on these gigantic projects, they didn't like that and eventually revolted and ended the Sui dynasty. And then we get to a couple of more dynasties, the Tang dynasty and then later the Song dynasty. Tang dynasty too is around, has a life of about 300 years or so. The main emperor that we want to concentrate on is a guy by the name of Tang Taisong. Um, and he, like many rulers that we've seen before him, expands his empire through conquest. And as I said, looking at things that we've seen from the past, he brings back Confucian civil service exams. That is to say, once again, if you want to work for him in the government, he wants you to know all about Confucius and the ideas of Confucianism, which makes total sense because if you remember, Confucianism is about respectful relationships between the rulers and the ruled, and then many other respectful relationships in society, especially the family. So bringing back the Confucian civil service exams allows the Tang dynasty to have a well-run government. They also created a new postal and messenger system, which is once again really quite important for ruling. The emperor can get his message out all over his empire. If you look at the shape of the Tang dynasty, you can see this sort of odd thing that's jutting far to the west. And if you've been paying attention, you probably know why that is part of the Tang dynasty. You can imagine that the Silk Road goes through that bit, and they're trying to populate the area around the Silk Road and protect the Silk Road by settling people around it. Wu Zhao was a female emperor of the Tang Dynasty. We don't oftentimes see female emperors, and so we like to mention them when women do something in the past that is extraordinary for the times. Well, the Tang Dynasty, like many dynasties before it, has very high taxes. They lose a number of battles, of military conflict with the Abbasid Empire, which is a Middle Eastern Muslim empire. The army was not excited about the Tang rulers and the high taxes and so on, and really was not very loyal to the emperor. Rebellions by the peasants, once again because of high taxes and so on, really was what ended this empire also in 907, to be replaced by a new empire, the Song dynasty. Another 300 or so year dynasty. It is smaller in terms of just land size, smaller than the Tang dynasty, but probably more stable and more prosperous, at least until the 1100s, when things start to go bad for them as well. Oftentimes in Chinese history, the Chinese were threatened by people who lived to the north and to the west of the heartland of China. That is very true during the Song Dynasty as well, and you will see that this is actually how Chinese dynasties end for a period of time when we have an invasion by the Mongols. We're going to be talking about the Mongols in this unit as well. The Song dynasty, like the Tang dynasty, has a strong Confucian bureaucracy. However, unlike the Tang dynasty, they were militarily weak. You can see there is no jutting out to the west that was protecting the Silk Road, for example. And they're really constantly threatened by northern tribes, people who are on the other side of the Great Wall of China. But once again, the Great Wall of China doesn't keep people out. It isn't a peasant rebellion, though, that ends the Song dynasty. It is this really large and ferocious attack by people who lived to the north and to the west, the Mongols, in 1279. The Song dynasty finally falls to the Mongols, and then, as we'll see later, Mongols are going to be taking over China, and we're going to have a Mongol emperor of China, and a dynasty of Mongol people who are running China for a period of time. Just a little bit in terms of epics for the Tang and Song society. We'll just kind of combine them together. In terms of the economy, something which is really quite important was what I mentioned before: rice. Rice becomes a staple that people are eating, and the rice was being, you could almost call it, genetically modified. This is just what people do to plants throughout history, is they grow seeds of plants that have qualities they want. And so farmers in Vietnam, for example, started to plant and harvest rice that grew faster and was able to be harvested more than once a year or twice a year or three times a year. And pretty soon you had this kind of rice spreading throughout Asia. It's fast ripening rice. It means that Chinese farmers can have a number of different rice crops every year. It means more food. It means a growing population, which is a good thing for the Tang and Song society. They also, as you could see, controlled the Silk Road. This allows them to trade with points west. Truly, they are sending silk to the Middle East and to Europe, and making a lot of money off of that for as long as they can control the Silk Road. They also started to increase sea trade. They build ships and trade with places that are islands like Japan, or places that are easy to get to by sea like Korea, places that are a bit farther away like India and Southwest Asia, and then even getting as far as Africa, and able to trade Chinese products for the products of all of those places. It makes for a wealthy society, and it makes for a happy society. Within society itself, when we're talking about social classes, there is a fairly large urban, that is to say city-dwelling middle class, people who are merchants, people who are artisans, the creators of goods, and then also the minor officials who belong to the Confucian bureaucracy. Also living in cities, you found just everyday workers, and then soldiers, and also servants. They're kind of the lowest bit of the social ladder. But as always, almost always, women are kind of second-class people, and this even increases over time. We know this because there is this kind of unusual habit or tradition or mark of beauty called foot binding. that starts to exist under the Tang and Song society. And this is going to seem very odd to you, I think, but it was thought that women who were wealthier, well, really all women, should have small feet. Small feet were viewed as something that was very, very attractive. And some women who didn't have to work even went as far as to try to make their feet smaller. And they did this by something called foot binding. And so when a baby girl was still very, very small, they would wrap their feet, they would bind their feet so that their feet wouldn't grow, or they would actually over time kind of cripple them and have their feet grow under, kind of like fold into themselves, so that when they were older, they had crazy small feet, but they couldn't really walk on them without causing great pain. Now, you can see this photograph over on the side there. If you understand what this photograph is, this is a bound foot that you can just see. Those are toes that are have grown over many, many years underneath the foot. That is the heel of the foot that you can see there. And so while in a shoe this would be an extremely small foot, you can imagine how incredibly painful it would be to walk around. And I guess part of the reason why this is such a thing is because rich women or richer women didn't want to have to walk around so much like poor women. So it's a way of showing off your wealth as a man who has a wife who has bound feet and finds them attractive. It's just one of these customs that that kind of defy logic or defy explanation, but it's really quite fascinating. So foot binding. Another thing that's going on in terms of culture is that foreign trade is spreading Buddhism. You might remember that Buddha, it was actually Indian, and Buddhism spread to China also through trade. And from the trade that China is having with other countries like Vietnam and Korea and Japan, the merchants who go there are Buddhist, and they tell people about Buddhism, and cultural diffusion happens, and many people in those places adopt Buddhism as well. And then there's a Neo-Confucianism happening. This is just a continuation or a new kind of respectful relationships between people in a family and between the ruled and the ruler, and then having an educated bureaucracy that's doing their best to serve the people, just like Confucius wanted them to. Just a few things that we'll throw together for the Tang and Song in terms of technology. You've got a magnetic compass that, of course, helps with seaborne trade. People can tell which direction they're going. Gunpowder was invented under the Tang dynasty, and this is the beginning of some very effective weapons, very scary weapons. The first thing they have is fire arrows, where arrows have gunpowder attached to them, and they blow up and they make a lot of noise and are propelled in kind of like a rocket way. This eventually leads to primitive firearms and cannon, and then the gunpowder technology is going to spread all over the world, and people who have gunpowder are going to be able to conquer people who don't. And so the Chinese invented that. They also came up with and were using paper money. That's a great improvement over just coins and having to have precious metal for coins. They also had a kind of thing called porcelain. You might have seen this before. It's what fancy dishes are made out of. Oftentimes, they came up with a way of doing this that nobody else knew about for a really long period of time. We're able to trade that along the Silk Road. They came up with the idea of movable type. In other words, a kind of really early printing press. And then also a mechanical clock, and let them know what time it is. So all of those things are technologies that you might find under culture and in epics for the Tang and the Song. Moving away from China and moving over to Japan really for the first time, Japan is really a fascinating country throughout its history. It's got a kind of strained relationship with China that we'll talk about, as I said, but Japan is not just one place. It's actually about 5 major islands. And the geography of having 5 islands instead of one place makes unification, creating one unified empire, for example, difficult. Now, the people, before they started to adopt Buddhism, were practicing something called Shintoism, which is about nature worship and these sort of godlike divine spirits that exist in nature, and then also ancestor worship. We saw those kinds of things in early Chinese religions as well, or spiritual beliefs as well. This thing is just called Shintoism in Japan. The Japanese like what they hear about from China. They get some cultural diffusion from China, including their system of writing. The art looks very similar. The Japanese copy the art of China, and then also through cultural diffusion, Buddhism as well. The capital of Japan at this point in time has the so-called Heian Court, and at the Heian Court you have an emperor, and you have very wealthy landowners, these lords called daimyo, and then shoguns and so on. It is a court which has a lot of very elaborate rituals and rules. You can imagine that it's a very fancy place, and the people who are there are very much kind of filled with themselves and believe their greatness to be absolute. What happens though is this: the emperor doesn't really have power for the most part of what we're talking about. The Chinese emperors have a lot of power. The Japanese emperors lose their powers to their main general, the shogun. And over time, the shogun or shoguns, one at a time, are the real rulers, and the emperors in at the Heian court can do whatever they want in terms of having elaborate rituals and rules and so on. The shogun is actually running the country, and they're running the country with feudalism. The shogun is using noble lords, protecting all of Japan with armies of samurai warriors. They're kind of like Japanese knights in a way, and those knights and those lords are ruling over a lot of peasants who are working for those lords and providing food and everything that those lords need in return for the protection of the samurai and those lords. Now, the samurai are, as I said, kind of like knights, and they have a code of conduct. We had chivalry for the European knights. In Japan, this code of conduct is called Bushido, and it's really kind of, in some ways, similar to what we found in Europe. The samurais are supposed to be courageous. They're supposed to show loyalty towards their lords and towards the shogun. They're supposed to show respect for their religious beliefs or for their gods, and they're just supposed to be fair towards people who are weaker than them. So it maybe isn't quite the same in the sense that that Bushido is created to keep the samurai from acting badly, kind of like it seems like chivalry was in Europe. But nonetheless, they have another code of conduct, and this is really, once again, a kind of feudalism, and that's why we call it feudal Japan. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I'd like you to go and take the lecture check or the lecture quiz, and I hope you get 6 out of 6 on that. Thanks. I'll see you soon.